Welcome to this episode of the Resourceful podcast. I'm here today with Carissa Rodgers, and she is a psychotherapist who practices here in Australia, also like in person and online. And she helps women with emotional pain and difficulties to resolve stress and trauma, so they can awaken authenticity, purpose, and meaning. That's just kind of a little nutshell. But why I wanted to, bring Carissa here and sit down and have a chat with her is because I met Carissa back in 2015 at an Awakening Women Circle facilitator training up in Binnaburra in Queensland. And I remember being really drawn to Carissa's work and her energy and what she was doing in and around helping emergency services with trauma. And I've been really interested in her work since, and the incredible work that she's doing in the area of trauma, but also the area of grief as well. And I'm constantly inspired by what she is sharing, insights, through the social media and practices. I could probably say, like, because I've seen a few practices shared, and just the wisdom and the way that she holds space, and that it just feels really grounded and embodied and a safe and sacred way that she just creates connection with people and community, and people can feel validated and seen. I just, picking up on that, where I see what she's doing in the world, I'm just very drawn to her work. And I see, at this time in human history, in this evolutionary, in this place of evolution, that for women to really reclaim who they are and resource themselves within goes back to that awakening, that authenticity, purpose, and meaning. And that work can be really, it's not fluffy work. It's really a commitment to going into those places like grief and like trauma, and like I've seen, read too, that Carissa sees trauma as a sacred gateway, which I really resonate with, because I also see grief as a sacred gateway as well into a deeper understanding of self and purpose and meaning. So I'd love to talk to you, Carissa, first. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Excited to have you. Thank you. Can you talk to us first how you came to do the work that you're doing right now with women in the world?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've been working probably with women for about 18 years. I began my work working with women and children in a community organisation. So in all the struggles that they come in with, whether that be relationship struggles or parenting or trauma or anxiety. So that's where the work began. But I think if we go back a little bit, it was the work really began on myself. So in my early 20s, just coming out of which is like 23 years ago, coming out of a really difficult time in my life. And I feel like that's where the healing work began. And I devoted myself to getting well inside myself, getting well and living a purposeful and meaningful life. And then I feel like the work with women is just really an extension of that, of a deep devotion to my own process of healing.
Beautiful. And so did you go into this work thinking, I'm going to work with with women around trauma or emergency service around trauma, or is that something that you came to you, or you just found yourself drawn to that way of working with those people in that area?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think the work calls you. Like, I feel like the work actually called me. Like, I began just as a general psychotherapist working with kind of any presentation that would show up in clients and in women. And then through my training, stumbled across trauma studies and felt like, I feel at home here. I feel at home here, not only my own personal journey, working through my own trauma, but then also supporting women to move through that as well. And I feel like since I committed to that, working with women with trauma, it's just continued to call me over the years, and have done quite extensive training in that field. And yeah, then in a way, I feel like the contracts to work with the emergency services also came to me. It's not something that I sought out.
Yeah. Do you find, you know, with you know, because with embodiment work, you know, I've found from my own experience that you can only work so far with trauma on a very surface level in a kind of counselling dynamic before you need to start to move into the body. And not all counsellors or not all health professionals in your area of expertise work with the body. You know, everyone works a little bit different. So can you talk to us a little bit about embodiment and the importance of moving into the body when we're doing this sort of healing work?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're correct in saying that not everyone who works with trauma specifically works with the body. And there's many paths to work with trauma. But in a way, I feel like just talk therapy is quite limited, because it does miss this whole other piece. And we know that what is left inside of us, what is unresolved, is usually incomplete experiences of fight, flight, or freeze. Right? And they're beyond the thinking mind, they're beyond the cognition. That's something that happens at that really basic nervous system level when we feel like we've been under threat or we've experienced an overwhelming event. So embodiment for me felt like absolutely the missing piece. And it's so great to see that it's getting a bit more of an airway now, somatic healing in terms of trauma. But reconnecting with the body, fundamentally coming back and reconnecting with the body, because that's the place where we're also reconnecting with our resources. The body holds an incredible array of resources we can draw upon for our own lives. So that reconnection in terms of moving through or releasing, although I don't like that word so much, releasing, I would more say that trauma is about integrating the experience through the physiology, integrating the experience. So not only do we have to come back to the body to integrate the traumatic experience, but along the way we find these incredible resources and gifts that the body can bring us, as well as just being able to have more options and choices when we can be freed up on the inside, or feel like we have enough capacity internally or space to be able to feel what we're feeling and let that move through and let that pass through.
Yeah, beautiful. Can you talk to me about connecting with the body and connecting with feelings? And I've always, it's more like probably a personal question, but I'm sure other women may have thought about this as well. When we move into embodiment work, the feelings are a very separate kind of vessel that can bring, us into a greater understanding of who we are. But it's, moving into the body doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be moving into or honoring your feelings. But can you talk to me a little bit about that, like how that integrates, or whether that's a separate pathway? Or
well, I think it's definitely in the same pathway, and that's really important for people to honor their feelings, but also let their feelings move through. But feelings are just a complex web of sensations. So in the deeper embodiment work, specifically when we're working with trauma, we want to come back to the physiology. We're working with the back part of the brain that's responsible for our survival responses, right? And so we come back to our sensate experience, right? Whether something feels warm or cool or tingly. So when we come back to our sensate experience, we're coming back and we're actually having a conversation with the back of the brain where the survival responses are initiated from. And so from there, feelings are, I guess, a production of a complex web of sensations together. But we're getting underneath the feeling sense, but we're including it along the way. It's not as if we're keeping it out. We're including it along the way.
And when we move into the back part of the brain with that fight, flight, freeze response, like that's heavy work.
That's heavy work.
That's heavy
Right.
work. Yeah.
It's heavy work. Right. Exactly. And work that takes a fair amount of preparation to do. It's not like someone would come in and we're working directly with the trauma that happened. There's a fair amount of prep work that has to happen in someone's nervous system around developing their capacity to be able to have good interoceptive capacity, which is their ability to know themselves from the inside out, which trauma often kind of shuts that down, to know themselves from the inside out. But then two, to be able to track their sensate experience, which is not something that we've really been taught throughout our life, to be able to track our sensate experience. And to be able to develop the capacity to not get frightened by that, and to be able to let sensations move through. So they can find some kind of resolution on a nervous system level. So there's a fair amount of preparation that goes into trauma work before we might even be talking about or moving closer towards the thing that was bad that happened to them.
And that goes along the lines, because I know that you've very, very openly spoken about how when you work with people, it's a long process, and we're so conditioned to have things done quickly. I want a quick outcome. I want this, and I've even reflected in my own work, watching you and what you share with yours, that quick commodified outcome, that we've got control over where we're going to pop out and a length of time, that it doesn't really honor that process that's, that you're going through in the body when you've had trauma that's deeply embedded, from childhood or a big traumatic event, even recently, that there is so many layers. It really speaks to the feminine, I suppose, or the receptivity.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we're conditioned in our society to want things really quickly. And that's for sure one thing that I don't promise people is, like, I am not a quick fix therapist. And particularly if someone's been living with, overwhelming experiences or trauma or difficulties or challenges for 20, 30, 40 years, that's not going to get resolved in 6 sessions. And the nervous system has its own time. And it's a lot slower than the thinking brain. We think we want things quickly because we want to feel better. But the nervous system has its own pace, and it's a lot slower. And so a lot of my work is around honoring the pace of the nervous system. Now, that's not to say that anyone can jump off it. They can jump off their healing journey at any time when they feel like they've had enough. That's certainly their choice to do so. But someone who may have had really early trauma, which is, attachment trauma or relational trauma. So there's challenges there of being in connection with others. That the foundation of the nervous system has been wired up in a pattern from unhealthy relating. That kind of stuff takes time. It really takes time. Some of the women that I work with, I may be working with for a few years. And I know in my own healing journey, it's ongoing many, many years.
Yeah, especially when it's attachment trauma as well, from, because it's hard to attach and connect, so the first response is to get out of there if there's a connection, or if there's, they get wobbly in that relationship building. So
Absolutely.
But I love that, because it really does bring you to a greater commitment. It reminds you of a greater commitment to yourself and your own processes, and the journey is not the end destination. The journey is the gentle peeling of the layers, or looking at different aspects of yourself and learning about yourself, and learning as though you're learning a new skill. And unwrapping yourself so you can really move into that full potential of who you are, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you spoke in the beginning around, women kind of seeking meaning and purpose. And I feel like that's the thing that begins to unfold once someone takes that journey into doing their own healing work. They're the layers that begin to come forward. Like you can't force that work. No. That's something that I what appears to me is to be something that's waiting to be found. And it will show up at the right time. We don't know the timing of that.
And do you put that meaning and purpose for women? Would you put that in, like, is it in a cultural, do you think that women culturally as well as familially placed in a position where they're shut down? I mean, you mentioned that too, like shut down from themselves, shut down from their potentiality, shut down from their bodies. Do you think that's just like a multi-complex layered, like a pattern of when it comes down the ancestral line, it's culturally, so every woman's impacted.
Absolutely. We can't really pinpoint one thing. Like you said, it's society, culture. It could be schooling experiences or family experiences or intergenerational trauma that has come through. But that seems to be a common theme in my work is that women are experiencing this kind of disconnection or shut down from experiencing, I guess, their authentic self or their true self. And that's where the meaning and the purpose seems to be connected with. So I do feel like we have an epidemic, I suppose, of women who are shut down. And you see that in their longing. Like there's a longing to feel, there's a longing for more, there's a longing for something else. And so in a way, the longing for that is the vehicle we use to support them to move through those places of being shut down. And it's a really healthy adaptive survival response. Like we have to be careful that we don't demonize being shut down. Like that happened for a reason and it's protected us well. It's just that over time, it may not fit our current life story. We may not need that particular response anymore. And I was just going to say, and our life force, our life energy is really bound up in that place as well.
In that longing, is that?
No, well? in the shutdown. So that's one thing that we're going to be really disconnected from is our sense of aliveness, our life energy in the world. It's going to be dim.
So if a woman's sitting here, and she's listening to that conversation, and how would she identify that shutdown sense in her body? Because I see it as, I can see it in their eyes. Like I can see like a hollowness happens for women and actually young children as well. You can kind of see it even at 5, 3, like an emptiness in their eyes and like they've been molded, or kind of like the wind's been knocked out of them, like their spirit's been knocked out of them, that makes them really who they are. For a woman sitting here and listening, how would she identify if she's shut down? Is it the longing? Is it the identify longing?
I mean, I think that's part of it, but usually that would manifest or show up in terms of symptoms. That's what we see on a physiological level. And so someone might describe themselves as feeling flat or numb or disconnected. Or just feeling like she's not living her true life. Or perhaps she doesn't actually really know what she's feeling. So there's a sense of not really knowing, what do I feel?
Yeah. And you talk about, and I mentioned early in the call, trauma as a sacred gateway. I love that. Like I just resonate with that. It just hits me right in the, I just know that's such wisdom. Can you talk a little bit about, because we avoid, the trauma response is that fight, flight, and freeze response. And it is a valid response to move away from a situation that feels dangerous. So trauma as a sacred gateway, coming to a point of, unpack that for us a little bit, because I can unpack it, but I'd like,
Great. Yeah, I feel like, well, it is. It's like when we enter the difficult territory, the things that are holding us back, from there, we can find some of our deepest resources or our deepest gifts. It's like moving through some of the biggest challenges can provide us with so many jewels that we can take into the rest of our life. And it really takes a commitment to want to enter into that, because often it can be fraught with such fear.
Yeah. And as we said, you know, it's heavy work, and we're kind of, you know, there is a perception that trauma is so terrible, and it is. I mean, it's in the body, it feels painful, and I don't want to diminish that or minimize that, because it is, but it is also, as you said, like a gateway, a sacred gateway to finding the treasures, the deep treasures within.
Finding the treasures, absolutely. Yeah, that's well said.
Yeah.
There's you know, I want to say there's something on the other side of it, but really it's like there's something through it. There's these pieces when you're moving through traumatic material or challenging experiences, there's pieces along the way that you pick up that you didn't know about yourself before. And there's ways of being that have to be cultivated as well. So in that sense, we're developing at the same time a sense of resiliency to be in the world.
Powerful.
Yeah, we find beautiful things.
Yeah.
Or else, why would we do it?
Yes.
Why would we do it? We find beautiful things. And, you know, I know that to be true, not only in my own journey, but after working with women for more than 15 years. I know that to be true.
And trauma impacts everybody. It's not just that you've had a big, huge traumatic event in your childhood, or, you know, a big, huge, you know, like an image of what, you know, what the culture sets as traumatic. Trauma can come in all sorts of different forms and shapes along the way, you know, like a divorce, for instance, or, you know, an experience with a child, you know, or a death can also bring trauma.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, it really does. And how we really define trauma is about it's not really in the event. It's in what's in the nervous system. So it's really what's left over in us. And in that way, it's going to be unique for everyone. So someone could experience two people could experience the same event, but how they process that or what's left unresolved in them, it could be vastly different.
Last year, we had an event, you know, just we're just speaking, like it's come up, and with our son who'd had an experience at school with a teacher and or a tutor, and we approached the principal because he was my son was quite upset about it. And the principal, who calls himself the conductor, it's a fairly new schooling model in Australia. He unpacked it with our son and created safety and moved through it. And he said to us at the time, it really, really hit me deeply that even though it was a traumatic event for my son, the way he dealt with it was whether it created a trauma or not. Does that make sense? So maybe it makes perfect sense. Yeah. And so
what you speak to is actually, you know, what the conditions that are needed for us to move through something that's challenging or overwhelming. And I mean, there's many conditions, but one of them is support and connection. To be in connection and to feel like there's someone there for us, helping us move through that.
And in that process, I saw really beautifully that it didn't become a trauma for my son. It became a learning opportunity, and he flourished and grew and could feel that connection of support around him, and that created a safe. It was an event in the end. It was a situation or an experience, you know. But it didn't have the pain of what trauma can bring when things are kind of washed over or minimized or moved. Yeah,
that's a really beautiful story. And there's something to be said for the community around us to acknowledge the experience and give us space to process that and be there for us.
So even in that, we could all learn to be skilled in how to support, you know, even if it's been, you know, from ourselves or someone that we know, how to support someone through an experience. So trauma is not the result of the experience.
Yeah, so it doesn't stick. Absolutely. And I'm really passionate about that. A large portion of my work has been teaching just, you know, non-therapists to be able to hold space for their fellow humans. And yeah, it's a really beautiful thing when people feel like they can gain a few skills and show up for their colleagues or their friends or their peers to support them in challenging times. And it's almost like a preventative measure to stop them getting into the therapy rooms.
Yeah, that's interesting. A preventative measure. Yeah. And that's, is that like, you know, I see that as a deep listening, you know, is that what you're talking about in that?
Sure. Yeah. I think that's part of it. Sure. Is being able to listen well, being able to find good enough language. Doesn't have to be perfect, because I think that if you are in connection and have a good presence with someone, you can be clumsy with your language. Right. So yeah, listening, language, connection, like looking at what's in us, like often teaching these people what's inside of you that gets in the way of you deeply connecting with another person. Is it your own prejudices? Is it your own traumas? Is it a skill thing that you just don't know what to say? So doing our own personal work. Yeah, so like just really basic holding space skills, what you would learn, I guess, in year 1 of counselling college.
Yeah, beautiful. I'd love to talk to you about grief, because I'm, you know, it was actually back in when we met in 2015 with that facilitator training that I was first introduced to the world of grief through another participant who was going to see Stephen Jenkinson. I'm not sure whether you know.
Yes, I've done. Yes, I just love him. I've done some training with him. Yes,
he's incredible.
He's incredible.
Yeah, I went to see him in Mullumbimby when he came to speak before COVID, and I just cried for 2 days. It was just his work is revolutionary, touches places.
His work, and I think, you know, it's like, you know, you're sitting at the foot of an elder when you're with Stephen. Right? Yeah, there's something really touching about that.
Yeah. One in a, like, you'll never come across another person that, you know, his story. Yes, I love him. And so I was introduced to grief in a completely new pathway, a little capsule that I didn't even realize existed, and it really hit really deeply. And I know you're doing some grief work as well. That's an area that you've been exploring and facilitating.
Yes.
Oh, I'd love you to speak to us about grief, you know, and what you see as really important in that work, particularly for these times.
Right. Yes. Well, I think it is definitely time to bring grief and death and loss out of the shadows, and to stop living like we also have all the time in the world, because we don't. Our time is limited, and I think, yeah, restoring grief and loss to its rightful place in our psyche as well. There's so many of us spend our times avoiding the feelings that comes with loss, and just carrying on in life as if we either get consumed by it, or we carry on as if we you know, haven't had any loss. And so I feel like it is time to restore its rightful place, in a sense, with everything that's happening on the planet right now. Like, there's losses on a mass scale. And we could sit here and, you know, name hundreds of them that are happening, but no one is immune from that. No one is immune from loss and grief. And I think traditionally, when we talk about grief and loss, people relate that specifically to death and dying. But in my grief circles, we'd like to extend that definition to just transitional change. And whether that's something that we choose, or whether that's something that's sudden and unexpected that life throws at us, as life does that for everyone. But we lose something every time there's a transitional change. And I feel like it's really important to allow ourselves to take the time and take stock, to just really acknowledge that, the loss that comes with even just daily changes, even changes that we wanted. And I feel like the cost for that, the cost for that is, again, part of that shutdown we were talking about before, the cost not doing that is numbing ourselves to the pain and shutting down.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it shuts us down it disconnects us completely from who we are and life and the people that we love, our community as well, as a protection mechanism, because we're not skilled from dot in how to process and how to sit with loss,
right,
and grief.
Right. Yes. Yeah, we're definitely not skilled in that. We don't know how to do that really well. And I think part of that just comes from the fact that we don't live in community like we once did. And so therefore we don't have the kind of holding that grief requires. It's part of the conditions to be able to hold and move through grief is that we also have a community holding us. And it leads us to kind of bigger issues, but we're disconnected from that sense of community. It's some griefs are just too big for one person to hold.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that their pathway to kind of managing that would be either to collapse into that or just avoid that entirely. And so part of the work is actually reconnecting with trusted, caring, safe people in safe spaces where we can process and experience the loss and really begin to update our internal maps of what's changed.
Do you find grief and trauma quite like linked, like that potentially the people who struggle with grief, expressing their grief or allowing their grief to rise, some of them need to work through trauma or traumatic experience?
Sometimes people will express itself as a grief, and there'll be some trauma behind that. But grief doesn't always necessarily have trauma attached to it.
Okay.
I like to think that in a way, because life is loss, right? And life is change, and that we all pass away and everything passes away, that there is a map or there is a blueprint inside of us to be able to move through grief. And part of the work is reconnecting with that inherent blueprint of knowing how to do this. And so there's not necessarily always trauma connected to it. Having said that, there's always grief connected to trauma. So if we've had a traumatic experience, there is always some sense of loss that's connected with it, whether that be a loss of a person, depending on what type of trauma it is, or whether that's just a loss of innocence or a loss of identity. There's always grief connected to trauma. And we know once we get to the grief work around what was missing and what was lost, and we know we're on the right track in terms of healing. But in terms of grief, there's not always necessarily trauma in there.
That's interesting. Yeah, I can see what you're saying. It definitely can be attached to trauma, but not the other way around necessarily. And I wonder how many, people would associate, I've got a trauma in and around that experience, so I'm not going to go into my grief because that's too hard, and use it as a bypass to go round.
Sure,
yeah.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah, and it could be just an indication of the sense of something so big on the inside to process that it feels like it would be. It feels like it would be a trauma. But in definition, it might not be. It could be just a limited capacity to know how to be with really big feelings.
Yeah.
And I think this is where other people come in. Other people trusted others can help us hold or help us be with, or even teach us how to be with some of these really, really big feelings. And in a way, I feel like nature does that for us too. That can provide this greater holding for grief, which is something that I'm exploring personally, and also in my work at the moment, is how do we allow the natural world to teach us about grief, that everything passes away, and also to allow the natural world this sense of being able to hold us.
With grief, I often see it as a portal into joy. I see it as you cannot really have that unbridled, joy. Happiness is very different to joy where I sit, whereas happiness comes and goes. Joy is that underlying innocence and that capacity to see through or beyond or the deeper treasures within any experience. It's life, really. That joy is life. And I see grief and joy as very interconnected together, as one is a portal into the other. Could you speak to that? What do you, yeah.
Well, I think that if we're shutting down any sensation or emotions or feelings inside of us, whether they're ones that we deem as not acceptable or not, we're going to be shutting down all feelings. So it would be hard to feel our joy if we're carrying this whole baggage full of grief. Like once we move into avoiding or collapsing or shutting down our experience, we become numb to it all, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So for sure, grief, allowing grief to flow in a way that it's meant to move through us, will allow other feelings and sensations and states of being to come forward. One of them, for sure, being joy. And another one, we find that sits alongside grief is also a sense of gratitude as well. I'm not one for practicing gratitude. I feel like gratitude is a naturally arising experience or state of being, and my experience is that through grief, gratitude arises.
Beautiful, yeah. So would you say that grief, is there any other portal, like if someone's wanting to move through their grief, what could they tangibly kind of set for themselves or vision for themselves as coming out? What does it also bring it into? What else is it a portal for?
Well, I think this is the great mystery. Like, wouldn't it be good to have a map, or for me to be able to say to someone, I know if you move through this grief, you're going to feel better. And this is, you're going to be in your joy. You're going to experience gratitude, which, I certainly don't say to people. But I think that's the great mystery, is that that's the part we find ourselves, that when we're moving deeper into the layers of our own grieving, our own sense of loss, our own, I guess, questioning around ourselves in the world, right? Some of those big existential questions around loss. There's no map for that. And I think it will take us where it takes us. And for each person, that will be unique and different. It's a bit like those treasures we spoke about before with trauma. It's like, I don't know what treasures people are going to find.
But it's...
I know for myself, I've recently had probably one of the biggest losses in my own life. My uncle, who I was very close to, took his own life just a few months ago. So I feel like I've been taking my own apprenticeship with sorrow, as Francis Weller would call it. And I know for myself, through moving through the grief, the depths of grief and despair, I feel like I'm still coming through. I mean, is there any end to that? But there's a sense of being far more connected to people and places and things. So for me, I know that's one of the treasures that has come out the other side, which is, other people might say something different. They might have a sense of aloneness as they're moving through. But for me, that's been one of the gifts, particularly going back to the nature thing, is through the grieving and allowing myself to hand over myself to something that's greater, like being with the ocean and being with the sky and being with the clouds and the birds, that I feel like I deeply have a sense of connection to the natural world that I didn't have before. That's come as a direct result of my grieving process.
Again, like that grief is like an opportunity, like a sacred gateway into a deeper understanding of self, life, purpose, meaning.
Right.
Yeah, it's individual. Yeah.
We're forced to look beyond the surface of things. Really is some say it's an initiation into soul, where we get to know ourselves more deeply.
And that person who's, no longer here or past, it's like they've given a gift, if you could even say that, for the people living, an opportunity for them to move into a deeper connection with what is life.
Even with the opportunities, like absolutely, even with the opportunities or the meaning that's come from it, it doesn't change the fact that you might still want that person back. Yeah. So even though there's these treasures and there's these gifts, you still wouldn't have wanted that to happen. Right? Yeah. So it's kind of like, how do you hold both?
How do you hold both?
The tragedy and the treasures.
Yeah. How do you hold both? That's a living, breathing, alive, every day, every moment, every breath practice. Really, it's a hard one.
Right, absolutely. And I think that's what grief also calls us to do, is not even just both, but many. How it calls us to hold many contradictory emotions and feelings and states of being.
Yeah. You can always see, as you're talking about your experience, that I can see really clearly, it really places that ideology that there's a black and white, or there's this way and that way. Sure. It's actually not. It's like that's like another false ideology.
Right.
There's not that. There's a space in between that we don't often are skilled at learning until we have these big initiations, like losing a loved one. That there's now a dance or a flow in between two very extreme, we would say, ways of being. That there's now no rules. There's no
rules. And this is what they would call the liminal space, and that great loss kind of forces us into this liminal space, which is the space between two things, or the space between two states of mind. It's really the place where the usual order of things is suspended. And entering into the liminal space can be a scary time for a lot of people. It's like the place between what was known and what's unknown. And the things that we can do to support us in the liminal space is finding just having some anchors that can help us hold us through that until we come out the other side. Many things can throw us into this space, not only grief, but that's really where it kind of forces us to enter into that unknown space in the liminal space.
And that's where we have the opportunity to resource, go within, and get and retrieve those treasures that can help us to stay anchored in where we're at. But and that's a one step at a time journey, knowing that you don't need to know everything for the next step, that it will be there when it's ready, when the time's there.
Can be a profoundly scary place for a lot of people. Yes, entering into that place, and as you said, it's the place of resources, but it's also the place of possibility and opportunity and creative potential. And this is often the place where a new life framework can be developed. It's potent. It's a potent time.
And rest time too, in that space of that void of resting and watching the trees grow, as I know that you're familiar with that as well, because you touched on that creativity. And would you say, in the macro sense, that's what's happening right now in the world, that we are between the known and the unknown, and everybody's feeling like this uneasiness of, how do I be, who am I, where am I going, what's going to happen, what's the world going to look like? And so they're all sitting in a lot of pain and discomfort because they just don't know how to resource, anchor, rest, or be just be in that liminal space.
Right. Yes, I think there's definitely a lot of uncertainty on the planet, and I feel like we've all been called collectively into a liminal space. Yes, and it really can be a challenge. And I think part of that is that we're not meant to navigate these spaces on our own. So it's even if someone did have the skills to be able to do that, but they may lack the support in terms of, you know, community or friendship or relationship. And given what's happening on the planet, where people are more disconnected just because of the COVID situation, it's even if the skills are there, sometimes the support is not. And that is a crucial piece of navigating places like this. Communities, we'd navigate this place together. We'd find ways of being able to move through that. So we're really called back into ourselves to figure that out. And that can be really challenging for a lot of people.
Yeah, particularly because they might not have done it ever before. This might be their first rodeo in that.
The first rodeo.
Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. And for those people, I say, you know, navigating this space can be as simple as creating just small daily rituals to get yourself through. You know, having a coffee or a tea at 9 o'clock in the morning, going for a walk along the beach at a certain time, or just finding ways where there's little anchors throughout the day.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Can I, because you're a mother of three, just to bring 3 girls, they're, you know, beautiful girls. How do you guide and hold space for them in relation to grief, particularly in and around grief? Because, you know, especially now too, because there's lots going on in the world as well for our young people too. And how do you integrate that into your day-to-day, or if...
Yeah, I feel like I've just recently been initiated into holding space for grief for my children. They were also close with my uncle, and my daughter also lost her cat, which was like her best companion. And so I feel like I've learned a lot about holding space as a mother for your children through difficult challenges like that. And I would say one of the first things is to really respect their boundaries, and to be guided by them with what they need, how much or how little intervention or contact they need from us. Because so often, as a parent, I think we're kind of intervening out of our own fear or out of our own heartbreak at seeing our children struggle. So I learned the difficult way of, my daughter really having to find a way to have boundaries with me, because I was just so concerned about her when she lost her cat, and she was so sad for a long time. And so it was really about just being guided by her with what she needed, and showing up in, connection, offering presence to her as much as she would tolerate at the time, as much as she wanted or needed. And also I think not problem solving. I saw myself go into that quite a lot. I just wanted to make it better. I wanted to problem solve. I wanted to give advice. And eventually I had to surrender to not doing any of that, because it just wasn't helpful at all. And so I think the presence and connection and respecting boundaries and being guided by children are probably the core things that we need to remember if they're struggling through grief. And then, of course, to not be scared to invite other people into the picture as well. Like we're called upon as parents to be everything and to do everything, but to build a community around the child as well, inviting a therapist, inviting a healer, invite other people in. And I think that's one of the biggest gifts we can give our children, is a sense of connection with other people, not only us. I certainly did that for my daughter as well. And so there's a community of us holding her through her grief, and we all have our little roles to play.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Remembering that community, because community is just so important. And you've touched on that as well. I know you do women's circles too, and building that collaborative, safe container for for women to be seen and heard. And that's right. We can't be everything. We can't be everything to everyone, particularly our children as well. We are limited in some ways in being able to meet them where they're at through our own conditioning or our own challenges as well. And yeah, it's important that they can feel support from
Absolutely.
lots of different people.
Yes, absolutely.
And that kind of, you know, probably it's really great even as a parenting, you know, model, not even just in grief, just creating those, you know, not problem solving when they've got a challenge in their life, but holding space for them, like we talked about earlier. You know, learning that skill of holding, you know, around language and listening and holding that connected space for them to unpack that.
Yes, absolutely. I feel like they're crucial skills as a parent that we all need is to learn the ability to hold space for our children as they move through their challenges. Absolutely. And learnable skills. I mean, that comes naturally for some parents. And for a lot of us, we have to learn some of those skills.
Yeah. And the children are a great portal in. Children are a great portal in.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they will just throw you right to your stuff. Yeah, sure. Great little mirrors, little gurus, I think.
Yeah, little gurus for sure.
Yeah.
Just nail it right, like they've got the hammer right on the nail.
Yeah.
Damn it. How do you know? You know, it's incredibly alchemizing parenthood, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a beautiful experience. Could you share a practice or a next step with anyone listening that can help them move into their body to support them through grief or to support them at this time with what's happening in the world? You know, how they can, you know, something simple that they can do.
Right. Yeah, I think I would probably just to come back to what I was talking before about the nature holding is to go out into nature, or if you can't do that in your home, perhaps you have some natural objects around, but just really tuning into the aliveness that nature offers us and seeing if we can feel that on the inside. So it's like, how do we make relationship with the natural world around us and begin to invite that in as a resource for whatever we have to move through. And if we can't go anywhere to do that, one of the ways that I like to do that is to really just simply rest my hand on my heart, particularly in grief, to just really hold the heart, and then to imagine. I imagine the ocean because that's the place I'm most deeply connected to. So to use all the senses. So I imagine the image of the ocean, and then I can smell the air, and to use the senses to come into connection with the natural world, even if we might be in an office at the time. But just to take a moment to invite that in. I feel like great grief requires great holding, and nature offers that to us.
It's powerful. I can feel like goosebumps over my body. I can feel that. Yeah, it does require great holding, and the greatest holding is that which is around us, that which is steady and
strong and present. And
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
I've loved this call today. It's been so enriching and beautiful to sit and sacred, actually, to sit with you at this time and talk about these really big, you know, trauma and grief, just really big areas that we tend to lean away from as opposed to lean into. And even from my own experience, you know, I've just found that I found so much treasure in the alchemizing of these big emotions, of these big places. And your wisdom today and experience and your sharing has been really deeply moving for me, and so needed in the world. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's been a beautiful conversation. Yeah, I hope your listeners get something out of it for themselves. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thanks, Barney.